Have you ever wondered why some of the most well-intentioned people, those who once stood for honesty, kindness, and justice, end up making choices that go against everything they once believed in? We often hear stories of leaders, activists, or even ordinary individuals who start with noble ideals, only to later be consumed by greed, power, or moral decay. It's easy to assume that corruption is a sign of inherent evil, that only bad people fall into darkness. But what if I told you that corruption doesn't always stem from malevolence? What if, instead, it's the result of a slow, unseen transformation, one that could happen to anyone, including you? The reality is, no one wakes up one day and decides to become corrupt. The shift happens in ways so subtle, so deceptive, that most people never even realize they've crossed a line. It starts in the shadows of the subconscious mind, where self-justification, fear, and survival instincts silently shape our choices. Today, we're going to unravel a hidden truth, one that exposes the psychological, emotional, and even spiritual forces that pull people toward corruption. This isn't just about politics or corporate greed. It's about understanding the human psyche itself. Because if we don't recognize the patterns that lead to corruption, we may unknowingly fall into them ourselves. So, let's dive deep, deeper than the surface explanations, deeper than blame or morality, into the real reason good people become corrupt. Corruption doesn't begin with a single act of greed or dishonesty. It begins in the mind, in the silent justifications, the small compromises, the whispers of self-preservation. Psychologists have long studied the phenomenon of cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort we feel when our actions contradict our values. When someone who sees themselves as good makes an unethical decision, their mind doesn't immediately label them as corrupt. Instead, it rationalizes the action to maintain internal harmony. I deserve this after all my hard work. Everyone bends a rule sometimes. It's just this once. This isn't who I really am. The moment justification begins, the descent has started. But why do people justify corruption in the first place? The answer lies deep in human psychology. Beneath our rational mind lies an ancient program: survival at all costs. We like to believe that morality guides us, but when faced with scarcity, status loss, or threats to our security, the subconscious mind takes over. Studies in behavioral psychology show that people who face financial insecurity, high pressure, or social exclusion are more likely to make unethical choices, not out of greed but out of fear. When someone sees corruption as a means to protect themselves or their loved ones, they are far more likely to engage in it without feeling like they've done something wrong. This explains why people who once upheld justice can later manipulate the system in their favor, because in their mind, they are just surviving. Nobody jumps straight into full-blown corruption. It happens in stages. What researchers call the slippery slope effect. A small lie today makes a bigger lie easier tomorrow. A minor act of dishonesty conditions the brain to tolerate greater acts in the future. Before they know it, they've built a new reality, one where they are no longer the good person they believe themselves to be, yet their mind has already rewritten the script to justify it. This is why major corruption scandals rarely start with a single act of betrayal. They begin with small, seemingly harmless compromises that spiral out of control. There's an ancient proverb: power doesn't corrupt people, it reveals who they truly are. But what if power does something far more dangerous? What if it rewires the brain? Neuroscience studies have shown that those in positions of authority experience a reduction in empathy and an increase in risk-taking behavior. Power changes the way the brain processes information. When someone gains influence, their ability to see the world through the eyes of others slowly diminishes. They start to believe their actions are justified because they are in control. They stop questioning themselves because no one else dares to. The very system that once kept them accountable now bends to their will, and before long, they have crossed a line they never imagined they would. This is why corruption is rarely the result of a single decision. It is a process, a slow, unconscious shift in thinking that turns a good person into someone they no longer recognize. The worst part, most people don't even realize it's happening to them. The greatest mistake people make when thinking about corruption is believing it is a choice between good and evil. It's not. Corruption is rarely about morality. It's about perception. People do not see themselves as corrupt, even when they are. Their mind has created a story in which their actions are justified, necessary, or even righteous. This is why even the most ruthless individuals often believe they are doing what's right. At the heart of corruption lies one thing: self-preservation. Whether it's the preservation of power, status, wealth, or simply a self-image, the fear of losing what one has can override even the strongest moral compass. This is why the most ethical individuals can still become corrupt under the right conditions. The subconscious mind is wired for survival, not virtue. When someone feels threatened, whether by poverty, competition, or the fear of failure, their mind begins to bend reality in their favor. Philosophers and psychologists have long studied this phenomenon. Carl Jung called it the shadow self, the hidden part of our psyche that contains the desires, fears, and impulses we suppress. When a person denies their own potential for corruption, they become even more vulnerable to it. The more someone believes they are too good to ever fall into darkness, the less likely they are to recognize the warning signs within themselves. This is why people misunderstand corruption. They believe it is something external, something that happens to others. They don't see that it is a process, one that begins within, in the small moments of compromise, the silent rationalizations, the tiny fractures in self-awareness. Corruption is not an outside force that invades the mind. It is already inside, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. Even at a neurological level, this process is deeply ingrained. Studies show that when people engage in dishonest behavior, the brain adapts. The first lie triggers a strong emotional response: guilt, anxiety, hesitation. But with each repeated act, the amygdala, the part of the brain that processes fear and morality, becomes less reactive. The more someone justifies their actions, the less guilt they feel. Eventually, corruption becomes second nature, not because they have become evil, but because their brain no longer registers their behavior as wrong. Most people never realize when they have crossed the line. They justify their choices as necessary, tell themselves they are still good, and surround themselves with others who reinforce their beliefs. By the time they recognize what they have become, they are too deep to turn back. Not because they cannot, but because their mind has already rewritten the past. Most people believe they would recognize corruption if they saw it in themselves. They think morality is a fixed trait, something unchangeable. But what if morality is not an absolute, but a shifting perception? What if corruption is simply a different way of seeing reality, one that feels just as logical, just as righteous, as the truth we believe now? The mind is a master of self-deception. Studies in psychology have shown that people do not act based on morality alone, but on how they frame their actions. If an individual sees their corruption as necessary, as a means to protect themselves, their loved ones, or even a greater cause, they will not feel like they have done something wrong. In their reality, they are still the hero. History is filled with examples of this. Leaders who begin with noble intentions slowly shift their perspective as power grows. They see themselves as the only ones capable of fixing a broken system. Their rule-breaking is no longer corruption, it's strategy. Their manipulation is not unethical, it's wisdom. Their critics are not voices of reason, they are threats. This is how entire belief systems shift. The mind constructs reality, not based on objective truth, but on what is useful for its survival. If a new version of reality protects power, wealth, or status, the brain will adjust its perception to make that version feel true. This is why people can commit the worst acts and still sleep peacefully at night. Their mind has made sure that in their story, they are still the good guy. But what about those who recognize their own corruption? The truth is, most people do not wake up to their own darkness until they have lost everything, until their illusions have collapsed. There is a moment when reality, no longer bends in their favor, when justifications no longer hold up, when they look in the mirror and see a stranger staring back. Some people break in that moment, unable to face what they have become. Others justify their actions even further, sinking deeper into the illusion. But a rare few awaken. They realize that corruption was never an external force. It was always a choice, hidden beneath layers of self-deception. The question is, how many of us are willing to look at our own shadows before it's too late? Because the deeper truth is this: the difference between a good person and a corrupt one is not as great as we'd like to believe. The same forces, the same fears, the same justifications exist in all of us. And until we recognize that, we will never be truly free from them. Imagine a young politician, passionate about justice, stepping into office with the purest intentions. In the beginning, they refused to take shortcuts, refused to be influenced by lobbyists, and hold themselves to the highest ethical standards. But then, reality sets in. They see how the system works. They realize that their idealism is a disadvantage. If I want to make real change, they tell themselves, I have to play the game. So they accept a small favor, nothing major, just a minor compromise to gain leverage. The next time, the compromise is slightly bigger. Before long, they are no longer changing the system. The system has changed them. Or take the story of a CEO who started with nothing, building their company with hard work and honesty. At first, they pride themselves on treating employees fairly. But then competition rises. A new company undercuts their prices, threatening everything they've built. Their advisors suggest bending a few rules, maybe cutting corners on employee benefits, maybe hiding losses to keep investors happy. It's not ideal, but it's necessary to survive. With each decision, their perception shifts. What once seemed unethical now feels like just business. In the end, they are no different from the corrupt executives they once despised. Even in everyday life, the same patterns emerge. A loyal friend who once valued honesty starts telling small lies to protect their own interests. A student, once committed to fairness, begins cheating on exams because everyone else is doing it. A worker who swore never to steal starts taking small office supplies home, justifying it as compensation for being underpaid. The process is always the same. The first act feels uncomfortable, unnatural. But as the brain adapts, the discomfort fades. The justifications grow stronger. The new reality becomes normal. And by the time they look back, the person they once were is gone. This is why corruption is not reserved for the powerful. It is not an anomaly. It is a process embedded in the human mind. The only difference between those who fall and those who resist is self-awareness. Those who recognize the first step, the first justification, the first rationalization, are the ones who can stop themselves before the path takes over. But here's the danger. Most people never see it happening. They assume they are immune, and that is exactly why they are not. Corruption is not a sudden transformation. It is a slow erosion of self-awareness, a gradual shift in perception that allows a person to justify what they once condemned. The most dangerous part? It never feels like corruption when you're the one experiencing it. Most people believe that morality is a fixed trait, that if they are good today, they will be good tomorrow. But the mind is more flexible than we realize. It adjusts, it adapts, it rewrites history to fit the choices we make. We do not change overnight. We change in the small moments, in the subtle justifications, in the quiet decisions that seem insignificant at first. This is why the difference between a good person and a corrupt one is smaller than we'd like to believe. The same fears, the same desires, the same rationalizations exist in all of us. The only real protection is awareness, the willingness to question ourselves, to confront our own justifications before they turn into something larger. If you think corruption could never happen to you, then it has already begun. Because the only people who can truly resist it are those who accept their own capacity for darkness, who see their own shadow and refuse to let it take control. So the real question is not whether good people can become corrupt. The question is, how far down the path will you walk before you realize you've already started?